Uh, Hello, friends. Today we are going to start, a topic on history. And if you like the video, please subscribe it as well as share it. So let us start the topic history. And today we will broadly talk on ancient history, uh, whereby I'll try to give an overall idea about what is ancient history. Now, before that, we need to know a bit about history as a whole. So, when we talk about history, uh, commonly what it is felt is that history is very extensive as well as it is factual. But in this class, I would actually try to make history a little bit more interesting. Now, when we say history, that it is more of factual things, then it becomes a bit boring. So, today we would see a new approach to study history. So, when how can history become more interesting? So, the first point is when we start approaching history not factually but converting into history or stories. So first let's know what's the importance of history. Why do we at all need history in our syllabus in any exam per se? Now see, when we talk about history, what we find is that we come to know about our past. This is the prior objective of studying history. The second aspect, why do we study history, is it let us know about you know about our civilization as well as about our culture, okay, which has taken place in the past. Now, when I say civilization and culture, there is a slight difference between the two which we need to be very clear about. Now when I say civilization, it basically indicates the physical features of on the basis of which we study history. But when it comes to culture, it is a broader perspective whereby we study history, in which all these spheres are included, which includes history, economy, polity, ethics, morality, and everything whichever is included in a particular civilization. Therefore, culture, when we talk about it, is much broader than only civilization. However, in order to know history, both the aspects are equally important. Now, so the next point is, in order to understand history, in a systematic way, we should know about the classification of history. Now, when we go into the classification of history, we find two approaches. Now, let us see what are those. Now, let us understand this classification very carefully. Now, there are two approaches, as I said. One is traditional, and the other is contemporary. Now, when we talk about traditional classification of history, what we find is that there is a scholar called as James Mill who has actually classified this traditional approach of history when it comes to Indian history. Now, he has divided it into three phases. The first is the what he calls was dominated by Hindus, the history which was dominated by Hindus, which started from the earliest period to 1206 AD. The next phase, what it talks about, was the Muslim period, which starts from 1206 till 1757. And last of all, we see that uh, the last phase was dominated by the Britishers, whereby it starts from 1757 and ends in 1947. This is what this traditional approach says. Now, here basically how we can relate is that when we talk about Hindu, the stage whereby Hinduism was dominated was when it was talking about the Vedic, later Vedic, etc. But when we talk about the Muslim era, it basically talks about the Mughal period. And when we talk about the British era, definitely it would suggest the British colonial history that was prevalent in India. Now, the next phase, the next classification is the contemporary classification, by which we can divide Indian history into again three parts. The first one is the ancient, second one is the medieval, and the third one is the modern. Now, when we see the ancient part of history, it starts somewhere in the earliest part, and then it is regarded to be ended on 1750 AD. But when we see medieval history, it starts from 1750 till 1957. And then the later part, the modern India, it starts from 1757 till 1947. Now, here also you can actually, you know, link this all these periods with the historical past of India. Okay, now we are clear about the classification of the history. Now, here in this class, we need to really know what was the exact situation that has led to this kind of transformation from one phase to the other. Now, if we see the overall picture, what is important is that to understand how exactly was the ancient society. Now, when I talk about ancient society, what we observe is that mostly uh, the society was you know controlled by a king, whereby the king used to control all the spheres of the society, and the king was all powerful. Now, when it came to the medieval period, what we notice is that when for the king it was it was actually becoming impossible to control the entire kingdom, then what the king thought was, for their administrative convenience, he started dividing the kingdom into many smaller parts, and thereby providing a authority over every respective parts who would actually work as the additional limb of the king himself. That means these authorities would actually work on behalf of the king. Now, this system was prevalent just because of administrative convenience, so that a well maintained system could be preserved, and whereby the welfare of the people would be enhanced or improved. Now, what is happening with this system came a different kind of phenomenon. What was that? Now, when this authority, who were called as nobles, they got certain amount of power from the king, Gradually, their hunger for power increased. And with this increase of power, with this increase of greed, what happened was that they started challenging the king himself. In other words, if you see that a particular region is controlled by a noble, and therefore the other regions, if for example half of the region gets combined and challenges the king, then the king really becomes very, very weak. And this is exactly what happened, whereby the nobility started exploiting the power and thereby taking up the kingdom in their own hands, or dividing the kingdom into various parts. Now, what happened at this stage, this is somewhat a model called as feudalism, whereby feudals become very, very important. Now, after this stage, when we see the modern stage or the British stage, how did this stage enter after this? Now, if you study the British history, what we find, how at all it was possible for the Britishers to get into India. Now, one of the reason was that the Britishers always took advantage of this divisive forces which were created by the nobilities. Now, what the Britishers used to do, they used to go and combine their power with this nobilities and thereby getting inside the kingdom. And that was the reason why the Britishers were able to enter India, by taking the advantage of this kind of divisions that already existed in the kingdoms. So, what we see is that a transformation from one stage of history to another and thereby to the later ages was due to certain phenomenon, certain systems which were going on in our society. So, this is clear that first it was dominated by the king and then it got divided and thereby the Britishers came to India, and which lasted till 1947, whereby we attain our freedom after a long freedom struggle, and thereby we have our present times. So let us see. Now, today we are basically going to discuss about the ancient India, an overall idea of ancient India, how it came into existence and all. So, therefore, we would go for another chart. Now, when we talk about ancient India, we'll have to know about how the classification of ancient India was done in order to understand history in a very systematic way, so that it actually becomes interesting. Now, when we see ancient India, what we need to understand is that when we talk about history, now in Indian history we see three distinct stages. One is prehistory, other is proto-history, and the third we call as history. Now, in order to understand this all these stages, what we need to know, what is the exact difference between all these stages. Now, prehistory is somewhere in the earliest times of history, whereby we do not find any kind of scripts, so therefore scripts were absent. Now, when there is no scripts, means what? We are not able to get any kind of recorded history about this phase of history. And when we don't get any recorded history in the form of writings, in the form of records, then it is really very, you know, difficult to get the exact idea what exactly happened in prehistory. So how do we find about this? We, we get various kind of archaeological findings, by digging the earth and all, and thereby, and also one thing was very much prevalent in this period was nothing but the paintings, the drawings, which were very crude in nature. However, that actually has given us the idea of this period of time whereby we do not find any script or writings. Now, the next stage is called as proto-history. Now, what happens in proto-history is that there are scripts. That means people of this stage has written some kind of scripts. But however, today we are not able to interpret or decipher those scripts. Therefore, we cannot, know exactly what was happening during this period of time. So, when we say we have scripts but we cannot read them because we don't know what exactly the scripts are talking about, the language which was used at that period of time is unknown today. So, therefore, for example, the Harappan civilization, which we generally refer in ancient history, there that also comes under proto-history because the scripts found in the Harappan civilization is not yet being deciphered. So that becomes a question mark. However, scripts were present in proto-historic period. So the last stage comes where we call it as historical period. Now, this is the phase where we find elaborate scripts and which we can read as well as interpret. Now, this stage can be related to the Vedic age, the later Vedic age, and the subsequent stages which came after that, whereby we find, writings in the form of records which were kept or which were written at this period of time, and the language used are actually, interpretable. That means we can read those language, therefore we can understand and know more about this historical period. So we're very much clear that history, Indian history, when we talk about it, can be clearly divided into three parts: pre-history, proto-history, and history. So now, when we talk about this prehistorical period, let us know a little bit more. Now, when we talk about prehistorical period, it basically talks about, the Stone Age. About the Stone Age. Now, Stone Age started from 26 lakh BC to 3000 BC. Now, this is the Stone Age, which started from, which is considered to be started from, 26 lakhs BC to 3000 years BC. Now, what is important in this stage is that, we can understand it by looking at the further division of this Stone Age. Now, this is Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. So, Stone Age could be divided into three more parts, whereby Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. Now, when I say Stone Age, means what? That in this age, stones were extensively used. Now, when we see the categorization of the Stone Ages, means nothing but, the evolution of this Stone Age into a improved form. For example, in Paleolithic times, we find, the stones in very crude form. Means, human beings are not able to interpret the exact uses of this stone, and therefore it was very crude in nature. Then thereby in Mesolithic as well as Neolithic, what we find, the more sharp features of the stone, which evolved with time, which evolved with human intellect, and thereby their needs which were there in the society. So Stone Age basically talks about Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. So this is there. Now the next stage is the Proto-History period, which basically talks about the Chalcolithic period. Chalcolithic period, which again can be categorized into three stages. One is pre-Harappan, pre-Harappan, Harappan, and post-Harappan. Now we know what is Harappan, that is the Indus Valley civilization. So when we talk about Chalcolithic period, means what? Certain kinds of metals were discovered, like the copper, the brass, etc. Now when metals were extensively used by human beings, that means the civilization were actually developing. People were knowing the usage of this kind of metals in their daily life, and thereby improving their life, every day. So when we talk about Chalcolithic period, we can relate it to the Harappan period and the pre-Harappan as well as the post-Harappan period, whereby people were, more improved. The civilization has improved rather than the Stone Ages. So this is under proto-history. Now when it comes to history, okay, which now when I said this stage of history had scripts, so very quickly we can relate it to which phases: Vedic, later Vedic, Mahajanapad, the Guptas, and the others who came thereafter. So this categorization of, Indian history can actually give us an idea of which classification, I mean, which stage was dominated by what kind of human intellect, as well as the improvement of civilization that took place stages after stages. So, uh, prehistory, proto-history, and history. Now we basically know about history, whereby Vedic, later Vedic, Mahajanapada, Guptas, and the other kingdoms existed. So we can very much relate to these stages with these days which we are here. So this is about the stages. Now, one more very important aspect about history that we should know is that when we talk about ancient history, there is a general classification of, oh, oh, oh. When we find this ancient history, some general points that we should consider is that, we should know uh, exactly from where we know that history started. For that, we need to know certain other classifications. For example, it goes like this. Now, uh, we classify history into two parts again. For example, Aerozoic or the Precambrian stage, and the second is Phanerozoic. Now, what is the basic difference is that in this period of time, it is considered that there was no life in this earth. But in this period, the later period, we find life. Now, let us see, if not life, then what was the historical evolution that happened? Now, this stage basically can be, in Indian context, can be divided into four parts again. Number one, Archean. Number two, Dharwar. Number three, Kurappa. Number four, Vindhya. Now, this is in Indian context which we can divide this lifeless stage of history, whereby Earth was actually evolving. So, therefore, we should not be so much concerned about this part. However, we should know the divisions. But when it comes to this stage, whereby we can find actually the presence of life, this becomes important for us to study. Now, when we come to this Phanerozoic stage, we find again it can be divided into three distinct stages. So, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Chernozoic. Now, again, in this two part, what we should know is that in this stage, the first stage, we see the life of plants, and in this Mesozoic, we find the life of animals. And this was the only period when we see the human being came into existence. So therefore, it is very important to know the evolution of life, which started from plants and then animals and then humans. Now, for us in ancient history, when we talk about history, what is important is to know about the human phase, how actually human being evolved. So let us know about this human phase. So I'll start with this one, Chernozoic, whereby we find that this stage again can be divided into two parts. Now when we talk about Chernozoic, we see tertiary phase and quaternary phase. Now in this phase we see the development of Himalayas. All right. And when we come to this quaternary phase, what we find? Pleistocene and Holocene. Now, what does Pleistocene means? It is basically the ice age. But however, human beings were there. Now, we need to understand one story in order to understand these two phases of human evolution. Now, when I say that Earth was covered mostly by ice, what we can predict, what was the kind of human life? We should understand that human life was, very, very, because if the land is fully covered with ice, we cannot go for agricultural production. So what was the basic means of livelihood of the humans of this stage is obviously, you know, hunting as well as gathering food. As this stage was very, very cold, so therefore the humans used to hunt bigger animals and preserve them as the temperature was very low, therefore it could, you know, so thereby we cannot think of, much of the improvement at this stage. But later on, when the Holocene age came up, what was the difference was that, this ice, now this again leads to Paleolithic period of time. That means ice age, then it comes to Paleolithic, what I talked about in the earlier classification. Now, when we talk about Holocene, what exactly happened was that, the transformation of the weather took place in our planet, and thereby the temperature started rising up. And as a result, the ice started melting. And when we find, Himalayas, suppose, were already there, that means in the entire earth, all the mountain ranges were there. So ice, when we see the ice in a mountain range, what happens when the temperature rises, this ice actually starts melting. And when ice starts melting, what happens? The water, when the melted ice is turned into liquid form, that is water, which, actually rolls down of this mountain, thereby giving rise to rivers. So, rivers, and when these rivers actually are created, it actually carries a lot of material with it when it rolls down the mountain. Now this material gradually, gets settled in the river plains in the form of plains, and that's how different kinds of plains are being formed in the entire earth. Like, the Tibetan plain is there, and many other plains that we find in earth today. So when we find that there is water, there is plains, obviously we can understand that thereby agriculture started in history. And when agriculture started, when people started doing agriculture, so what happened? People actually started settling down in the places near their, agriculture. And when they started settling there permanently, it means what? Villages came into existence. And when villages came into existence, simultaneously, domestication of animals also took place. And therefore, after this Holocene period, we find a very faster development which took place in human history, whereby we find that, human history was actually taking a systematic turns in every stages of its development. So this is how this history of human being, evolved, if we understand it in a systematic way. So this, so we can say that after this Holocene period, all the human activities started, and thereby we can say the evolution of human being took place in a more enhanced way, and thereby which led to their development of human being as well as the human society. So this is the gradual history which I have shown you, that how it has actually taken place with time, with the evolution of time. Now, when we talk about ancient history broadly, we find a lot of topics in it. But however, for our syllabus or for our examination point of view, basically the Indian history starts from the Harappan civilization. We consider it to be the starting point of the ancient history, what we study in Indian context. We talk about Harappan civilization, and thereby we talk about the Vedic age, then the later Vedic, then the Guptas, Mauryas, and all other kings who have come to India and settled, and thereby they were driven away by some other kingdoms, and the history has evolved in this way. And therefore we come to the medieval period, whereby we have seen Muslim domination, which took place for a considerable period of time, when we see a dominant role of the Mughals in the Indian history in shaping the politics, economy, society, culture, everything of the Indian society. And at the later stage, we see that the Britishers came to India, and thereby, you know, imposing the colonization of India with time. And we see there is a long colonial struggle that went on between the Britishers and the Indian people, and thereby we attain independence with the help of the different freedom fighters who have contributed a lot towards the Indian history. So therefore, we today we conclude our class by uh, you know saying that history can be actually interesting when it is studied in systematic way as well as in the form of stories. So therefore, ancient history, when we talk about, it is a chronological there is a chronological pattern that needs to be followed in order to understand it very comprehensively. So thank you so much, and if you like the video, please subscribe it as well as share it as much as possible. Thank you.